Imagine the scene. New York, summer of 1929. Skyscrapers rise skyward like humanity's attempt to reach the heavens, racing against itself. Automobiles buzz through the streets, neon signs flash bold slogans, jazz plays on the radio, and crowds fill cafes, theaters, stock exchanges, and dance halls. This is America, an America celebrating, an America growing rich, an America convinced that tomorrow will be even better than today. These were the Roaring Twenties, an era of explosive economic optimism bordering on madness. The nation still remembered the horrors of the Great War, but now it seemed all tragedy was safely behind. Stocks soared higher than ambition itself. People bought shares not because they understood how the stock market worked, but because everyone else was buying. After all, what better proof of success than your neighbor buying a Packard with his stock profits? "We have entered a new economic era," declared Columbia University President Nicholas Butler at the time. "The market regulates itself, poverty is vanishing, prosperity will be eternal." Millions agreed. Every day, newspapers printed new Dow Jones records. "Buy now, profit tomorrow," screamed the advertisements from brokerage houses. Ordinary clerks, hairdressers, taxi drivers, even housewives bought stocks on credit. So-called margin loans allowed people to invest massive sums with just a fraction of their own money, only 10% down, and you owned a portfolio. As long as the market rose, you grew rich. If it fell, your debt devoured everything you owned. Risk? Of course. But the market was rising, so in theory, there was no risk. Behind this party, however, lurked the filth. The elites controlling the major corporations and banks played their own financial games. The stock market mania was a convenient tool for manipulation. Amateur investors were oblivious to backroom deals, pumping of stocks, conspiracies of the major players who inflated prices only to dump shares, leaving the public with worthless scraps of paper. The more money people poured in, the higher this house of cards rose. Gravity, it seemed, no longer applied. America had discovered the secret to infinite wealth. Only a few voices warned that every euphoria ends in disaster. But no one listened. They were dismissed as pessimists, losers, people who just didn't understand the new economy. "Why work at a factory if money grows on the stock market?" some asked. "Why be an idiot and not invest everything I have?" others wondered. Meanwhile, in plush Wall Street offices, they sipped expensive whiskey and smoked Cuban cigars. They already knew the party was nearing its end. But, as always in financial bubbles, the smartest fled first. The crowds continued to dance, unaware that the floor beneath their feet had already begun to crack. America was standing on the brink of its greatest catastrophe. But it didn't know it yet. Let's step behind the glittering curtain of the Roaring Twenties and see how that towering house of cards was built, the one that would soon collapse upon all of America. At the time, the U.S. financial system resembled a loud party with no security guards. The Federal Reserve, established only in 1913, still lacked clear mechanisms to regulate credit and financial markets. Banks operated with virtually no oversight, while the stock exchange became an experimental playground for financial adventurers. The main fuel for this fever was margin credit. Imagine, you walk into a brokerage firm wanting to buy $1,000 worth of stock, but you only have $100. The broker gladly lends you the rest, just 10% down, and you're an investor. If the market rises, you get rich instantly. If it falls, your debt devours everything you own. Risk? Of course. But everyone believed the market only goes up, so there was no real risk. An entire army of small investors rose up on this easy money. Secretaries, taxi drivers, farmers, students, all pouring their savings into stocks like Ford, RCA, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel. The stock market became a national pastime. But at the same time, another army was at work, an army of manipulators. These were the so-called pools, groups of major players who colluded to artificially inflate stock prices. They bought shares quietly, creating the illusion of growth, and when prices soared, they dumped their holdings, leaving small investors with worthless paper. These manipulations happened with the silent consent of exchange officials. In fact, many brokerage houses were actively involved in these schemes. Many top officials fully understood what was going on. Richard Whitney, president of the New York Stock Exchange, a symbol of stability and respectability, was personally involved in these manipulations. Within a few years, he would land in prison for fraud. The banking sector was not just a passive observer, it eagerly fueled this orgy of uncontrolled enrichment. Banks not only lent money to private investors, but also created their own investment funds, using their clients' deposits to buy up stocks, driving prices even higher. It was financial self-fertilization, the same money circulating through the system multiple times, artificially inflating stock values. Then there were the bucket shops, illegal gambling houses where people placed bets on stock prices without actually buying any shares. They were nothing more than financial casinos. Here, ordinary people lost their last savings, lured by the promise of easy, fast riches. The media fueled this euphoria even more. Newspapers, often controlled by the very financial magnates manipulating the market, published endless streams of optimism. Financial gurus assured the public, we are standing at the dawn of a century of prosperity. In his 1929 inaugural address, President Herbert Hoover proudly declared, we are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. But poverty hadn't disappeared. It had simply been temporarily hidden behind a wall of credit. Wages failed to keep up with prices. Farmers saw their profits collapse as grain prices dropped, and small business owners drowned in debt. Millions of Americans lived on the edge, supporting their lifestyles with constant borrowing. And behind it all stood very real people, financiers, politicians, industrialists, fully aware of how fragile the system was. But each one hoped to grab their winnings before the final collapse. It was a game with lit dynamite. The fuse was already burning. October 1929. The atmosphere on Wall Street resembled a drunken ball that had long since crossed the line of sanity. Stocks began to wobble. Nerves were tightening, but most investors still believed this was only a minor correction, a brief turbulence. After all, America always grows, doesn't it? On October 24th, 1929, came the day that would forever enter history as Black Thursday. From the very morning, it was clear something had gone wrong. A wave of panic selling swept across the New York Stock Exchange. Chaos reigned in the trading hall. Brokers shouted at each other. Phones rang nonstop. Messengers scurried about with urgent orders. Every new wave of falling prices triggered even more panic among investors. A crowd gathered outside the exchange. Some came out of curiosity. others hoping to learn if their savings had survived, and some simply watched as an entire generation's dream crumbled before their eyes. By midday, the big bankers, including J.P. Morgan Jr., tried to intervene. They assembled a consortium of banks that began buying up stocks en masse, attempting to show the market a display of stability. This brought a brief pause. Newspapers rushed to reassure readers that the panic was over, but within days it became painfully clear this was only the prologue to tragedy. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, came the final collapse. Over 16 million shares were sold that day, an unprecedented volume. Prices fell so fast that the stock ticker couldn't keep up. Entire fortunes vanished in minutes. People watched helplessly as their life savings evaporated right before their eyes. The stock exchange turned into a madhouse. Some wept and tore their hair, others fainted, some even jumped out of windows. Although the actual number of suicides was often exaggerated by the newspapers, the atmosphere did indeed resemble the end of the world. The crash stripped away the mask from the entire system. It became clear that much of the stock market's rise was built on lies, collusion by stock pools, fraudulent manipulations by banks, credit pyramids. All of this financial architecture had been nothing but a soap bubble. Small investors were left with debts they could never repay. Their American dream had turned into personal ruin, yet not everyone lost. The shrewdest big players had exited the market in time. Some made enormous fortunes by short selling, betting on the market's fall. The most cynical profited while watching the destruction of millions of lives. The government's reaction was astonishingly helpless and cold. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon advised the president, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. People will work harder, live a more moral life. It was a merciless position that doomed millions of Americans to poverty. The stock market crash was only the beginning. The true economic hell was just opening its gates. Once the stock market foam had settled, the real struggle for survival began. What followed the Wall Street crash went far beyond stock prices. This was no longer just a financial crisis. America was descending into a full-scale economic catastrophe. The banking system was among the first victims. Banks that had recklessly issued loans for stock purchases now faced total insolvency. Their customers' savings had been invested in shares that were now worthless paper. And when depositors rushed to withdraw their money, one bank after another collapsed. By 1933, over 5,000 banks across the country would fail. Panic only fed itself. The more people tried to withdraw their money, the more banks collapsed. Long lines outside bank branches became a daily scene. People would queue overnight, desperate to recover their savings before their bank shut its doors. And many didn't make it in time. Corruption flourished in full view. Many bankers secretly moved funds out of their institutions before collapse, protected by backroom deals with local officials. Big businesses bought up the assets of small entrepreneurs for pennies on the dollar. Factories, shops, farms, entire livelihoods changed hands at fire sale prices. Some, of course, managed to exploit the chaos for their own gain. Millionaires and financial acrobats snatched up real estate, businesses, and farmland from bankrupt owners at symbolic sums. A new class of crisis billionaires emerged, those who multiplied their fortunes on the ruins of others' lives. Ordinary Americans lost everything. By 1932, unemployment would reach 25%. Millions were left jobless, homeless, and destitute. Across the nation, makeshift tent cities of the homeless sprang up, bitterly dubbed Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, who stood helplessly watching the nation's collapse. In small towns and rural areas, farmers went bankrupt by the thousands. Falling crop prices made it impossible to sell harvests, even at cost. Many lost their farms to debt, their land seized by banks or speculators. Hunger swept entire regions. Soup lines became part of daily life in big cities. Charity kitchens handed out broth and a slice of bread to people who, not long ago, had considered themselves middle class. Poverty reached such a level that a new term emerged: the invisible unemployed. These were people who still had clothes, watches, furniture, the remains of a former life, but no job, no income, and no hope. On the outside, they still looked respectable, but inside, they were falling apart. The crisis shattered not just the economy, but the nation's psyche. Mental illness, despair, and suicides rose sharply. People were losing more than money. They were losing their very sense of meaning. Meanwhile, the government clung to its old formulas, hoping the market would somehow heal itself. The mantra of the invisible hand of the free market sounded more hollow by the day. America was sinking steadily into the darkness of the Great Depression, and the bottom was nowhere in sight. Amid the economic collapse, the nation desperately needed bold action. But at its most desperate hour, America became trapped by its own illusions, the unshakable faith that the invisible hand of the market would somehow correct everything on its own. And at the center of this ideological blindness stood President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was not a thief or a cynic. He sincerely believed in individualism, free markets, and minimal government interference in the economy. Before the Great Depression, he was known as the great engineer of prosperity, the man who had organized relief for Europe after World War I, a successful administrator and humanitarian. But in the face of catastrophe, his principles became deadly for millions of Americans. Hoover believed that any government intervention would only worsen the situation. He urged businesses not to cut wages and unions not to demand raises. The government called for self-regulation, but the market did not save itself. Business owners slashed wages, fired workers en masse to protect profits, and left millions jobless and destitute with no state support. Even at the peak of the crisis, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon continued advising Hoover: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. People will work harder and live a more moral life. It was brutal, social Darwinist logic that completely disregarded human tragedy. The elites did not suffer. Bankers, industrialists, and major landowners found ways to shield their assets. They could weather short-term losses. Many even profited, buying up bankrupt businesses and farms at fire sale prices. One of them cynically remarked, "Depressions are the best time to buy." One of the most cynical episodes was the violent crackdown on the hungry. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington. They demanded early payment of bonuses promised for their service. Men who had once fought for their country now sat in tent camps, hungry and penniless. The government answered their pleas with tanks. President Hoover ordered the Army to disperse the demonstrators. Leading the operation were future military icons, General Douglas MacArthur and a young Major Dwight Eisenhower. Soldiers burned tents, beat veterans with clubs, and fired tear gas into the crowds. Images of veterans bloodied and choking in the smoke spread across the nation. This brutal episode became a moral disaster for Hoover's administration. A nation once proud of its soldiers was now clubbing them for demanding their rights. Public trust in the government plummeted to historic lows. At the same time, Hoover delayed meaningful aid to ordinary citizens. Only at the very end of his term, under mounting pressure, did he create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a state bank designed to aid banks and corporations. But as always, the aid flowed first and foremost to big business, not to the unemployed or desperate farmers. Instead of bread, new loans for bankers. Hoover failed to see the obvious. In times of historic crisis, the old rules no longer work. A new politics was needed, a new approach, a new era. America stood on the brink of change, and change was already coming to meet it. By 1933, America stood on the brink of total collapse. Fear, despair, hunger, bankruptcies. The nation was drowning in darkness, and at that moment, a new leader stepped onto the stage, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His victory in the 1932 election was overwhelming. Hoover had left himself no chance. The people weren't simply looking for a new president. They were searching for hope. Roosevelt brought what America so desperately lacked, the belief that this horror could be fought. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Those words became the symbol of a new era. Roosevelt wasn't a revolutionary in the classical sense. He remained loyal to capitalism, but understood the system had to be saved from itself. Thus began his famous New Deal, a massive program of economic and social reforms, the likes of which the United States had never seen. The first 100 days of his presidency would enter history as an unprecedented sprint of reforms. Dozens of new agencies, programs, and funds were created, earning the nickname Alphabet Agencies for their abbreviations: CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps; WPA, Works Progress Administration; NRA, National Recovery Administration; TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, and many others. They all had one goal: provide jobs, support production, and stabilize the financial system. The government began unprecedented intervention in the economy. Banks were temporarily closed for audits. Strict regulations were introduced for brokers. Federal deposit insurance systems were created. Large-scale infrastructure projects were launched. Bridges, roads, dams, power plants. Millions of people found employment through government programs. From farmers to architects, everyone had a chance to contribute to rebuilding the nation. First, Lady Eleanor Roosevelt played a special role in the new politics. She became the face of social justice, meeting with the homeless, advocating for African American communities, fighting for women's rights. She transformed the role of First Lady into a powerful political platform, something no one had done before. But the New Deal should not be idealized. Behind the lofty slogans were also darker sides. Many programs effectively bailed out large corporations with government funds. Some projects created conditions for new financial monopolies to emerge. Corruption, favoritism, and abuse of power remained part of the process. The NRA, National Recovery Administration, faced particular criticism. Officially, it was meant to regulate wages, prices, and industry standards. In reality, large companies used it to suppress competition and protect their dominance. Small businesses often found themselves pushed aside. Conservatives accused Roosevelt of establishing a state dictatorship. Some even claimed the U.S. was sliding toward socialism. The Supreme Court struck down parts of his programs as unconstitutional. A fierce battle between the branches of government unfolded. But Roosevelt's main goal was achieved. He restored people's faith. America slowly began to revive. The market stabilized. Confidence in the banks returned. People once again started investing in the economy. The New Deal didn't solve all problems. The country would only fully emerge from the Great Depression with the onset of World War II. But Roosevelt's policies gave America a chance to survive its darkest times. It was not merely a set of economic measures. It was a battle for the very soul of the nation. Although the Great Depression was born on Wall Street, its consequences knew no borders. The world economy was already tightly connected, and when America began to choke, a chain reaction quickly swept across the globe. Europe was the first to stagger. Many old world countries were still drowning in debt from World War I. The United States had become the primary creditor, and when American banks collapsed, the flow of money to Europe dried up instantly. The economies of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, one by one, they began to crumble. Germany was particularly vulnerable. After the hyperinflation of the 1920s, its economy had only just stabilized, largely thanks to American loans through the Dawes and Young plans. But when U.S. financing abruptly stopped, Germany plunged into shock. Factories closed, unemployment skyrocketed, and political stability began to fracture. In this atmosphere of despair, fear, and hopelessness, radical parties gained traction. And in this soil, the dark figure of Adolf Hitler began to rise. The Depression made the Nazi rise to power possible. Hunger, the humiliation of Versailles, and mass unemployment became fuel for nationalism and anti-Semitism. By 1933, as Roosevelt was launching his New Deal, Hitler had already become Germany's chancellor. Two nations, two completely different paths out of crisis. Britain faced its own economic upheaval, collapsing exports, mass layoffs, and the devaluation of the pound. In 1931, Great Britain abandoned the gold standard, a symbol of financial stability for decades. It was a historic shift. From Latin America to Canada, from Asia to Africa's colonies. Everywhere the same song played: falling exports, deficits, unemployment, political instability. In many countries, the Depression became a catalyst for authoritarian regimes. Economic desperation birthed political dictators. Japan, struggling with plummeting silk and textile exports, turned toward militarism. The Depression became one of the drivers behind Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. A global economic crisis was slowly transforming into the prelude to global conflict. The Depression also exposed the fragility of the international system. The League of Nations, created after World War I to prevent new conflicts, proved powerless against economic chaos. Every country scrambled to save itself, turning inward with protectionism and tariff wars. The Great Depression revealed a simple but terrifying truth. When the economy collapses, everything collapses. Democracy, morality, stability, even the very notion of a civilized world. Economic catastrophe became the trigger for the political storm that, within a few years, would erupt into World War II. The dark legacy of the Great Depression didn't vanish even after the war. Its lessons remained deeply embedded in all subsequent political decisions. Lessons about the danger of unregulated markets, about the power of panic, about how fragile society becomes when people lose not only their money, but their faith in tomorrow. The Great Depression was one of the worst economic catastrophes in human history, but it was more than just a crisis of money, banks, and stock markets. It was a crisis of society itself, of its faith, morals, culture, and human relationships. During these years, humanity revealed its entire nature, both its worst and its best. We saw the boundless greed of financial speculators who extracted profits from the collapsing system until the very end. We saw cynical politicians who turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions. We saw despair driving people to suicide, crime, and radical ideologies. But at the same time, we witnessed the opposite. Volunteers distributing food, farmers banding together to support one another. We saw new leaders trying to restore hope, building systems of social security, and helping people survive. The Great Depression showed that the economy is not merely markets and money. It is trust. It is mutual responsibility. It is the balance between free markets and social justice. Its lessons remain relevant even today. Every financial crisis of the 21st century, every market crash, reminds us how thin the line is between stability and chaos, and how quickly the illusion of wealth can turn into a collective nightmare. Because in the end, behind all the numbers, stock prices, and interest rates, one question always remains: how well can humanity learn from its own mistakes? Dear friends, thank you for listening to our story about the Great Depression, this drama of money, power, and human nature. If you enjoy these kinds of slow, deep historical narratives, make sure to subscribe to our channel. And please leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is. We're always curious to see how many corners of the world are joining us. We've just left the United States, a country barely pulling itself out of the Great Depression. There, millions lost their jobs, homes, and dreams. But even at the worst moments of America's catastrophe, the dollar remained the dollar. It was still accepted by the grocer, the bank, and the bakery. Now we shift to Germany in the early 1920s and enter a different reality. Here, paper money lost all meaning. A loaf of bread cost 100 marks at first. A week later, 1,000. In a month, 1,000,000. By the end, 100 billion. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Children played with stacks of banknotes as building blocks. Firewood cost more than currency, so people burned bills to heat their homes. Imagine this. You're paid twice a day, morning and afternoon, just so you can rush to the store before your wages lose even more value by evening. Restaurant waiters sprint between tables, updating prices during lunch as inflation rises mid-meal. Retirees who had saved their entire lives now beg for soup in bread lines. But behind this surreal absurdity stood more than reckless policies. This was a story of defeat, humiliation, international greed, political intrigues, betrayals, and fatal decisions that turned Weimar Germany into an economic wasteland, and ultimately opened the door for the most monstrous force of the 20th century. What pushed Germany into this abyss? Who betrayed the nation for personal gain? And could it have been stopped, but wasn't? Today, we pull back the curtain on one of modern history's darkest economic tragedies. Catastrophes rarely strike suddenly. They grow gradually, like a spreading illness. And Weimar's hyperinflation was exactly that, a poison that began flowing through Germany's veins long before the first banknote with endless zeros rolled off the printing presses. It began in 1918. World War I ended with the humiliating surrender of the German Empire. The Hohenzollern monarchy collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile. The country was left with wounded soldiers, widows, cripples, demoralized veterans, and bankrupt citizens. But the worst was yet to come. In 1919 in Versailles, the victors, France, Great Britain, the United States, and their allies, imposed a crushing peace settlement on Germany. The Treaty of Versailles dictated Germany must accept full responsibility for the war. It must pay massive reparations, over 132 billion gold marks, about 33 billion US dollars at the time. It lost territories, colonies, and parts of its industrial base. Its military was reduced to a token force, while Allied troops occupied the Rhineland. For the German nation, this was not simply financial pressure, it was national humiliation. Many saw Versailles as a stab in the back, a betrayal by their own politicians who had signed both the surrender and this document of shame. Economically, it was a trap with no exit. The reparations weighed heavily on the state budget, paralyzing the currency and crippling industrial recovery. Germany couldn't export enough goods to cover its debts, and borrowing abroad was largely blocked. At home, political chaos only deepened the crisis. The Weimar Republic was born out of disorder, where communists and monarchists regularly tried to seize power. Coups and uprisings became almost routine. Political stability was fragile, economic stability an illusion. The government found itself trapped in a vicious cycle. To pay reparations, it needed money. To get money, it printed more. The more it printed, the faster the mark lost value. The weaker the mark, the harder it became to meet obligations. And so, downward in a spiraling collapse. The Treaty of Versailles not only failed to stabilize Europe, it laid the foundation for future disasters. It turned Germany into a powder keg with a lit fuse. And far worse decisions were still to come. In every great economic catastrophe, there comes a moment when a government faces a choice: painful reforms or the easy solution, print more money. Weimar Germany chose the easy way and turned the printing presses into a national engine of destruction. At first, printing money seemed almost harmless. The country needed funds for post-war reconstruction, social programs, support for veterans, and most of all, to pay the crushing reparations that sat on the budget like a concrete slab. The government borrowed from its own central bank. This was called temporary issuance, but temporary quickly became permanent. By 1920, inflation began accelerating. Before the war, $1 US equaled around 4 marks. By 1921, it was already over 60 marks to the dollar. Still, this was not yet a catastrophe. Minor officials reassured the public this is a natural process of adjustment. Behind the scenes, however, a much darker game was unfolding. Some officials and bankers fully understood the weaker the mark, the easier it was to export goods. Exports grew, foreign currency flowed in, and businessmen grew rich. Certain industrialists even lobbied for further devaluation, since it temporarily boosted their profits. Several German banks began openly speculating on the currency, buying foreign currency, transferring assets abroad, and making enormous profits from exchange fluctuations. For the financial elite, inflation became a new source of wealth. Meanwhile, officials in Berlin tried to convince the public that devaluation was helping to ease the burden of reparations. If the mark fell, then debts denominated in marks shrank. But this trick only worked up to a point. Corruption flourished. Bureaucrats accepted bribes for access to credit, currency operations, and government contracts. Many elites quietly transferred their wealth to Switzerland, Holland, or the U.S., fully aware they were fueling the disaster they would later escape. For the middle class, the situation looked far grimmer. They were losing their savings, their wages were devalued, purchasing power shrank every month. People who had spent years saving for a home, a car, or retirement watched their wealth melt away like ice under the sun. Particularly cynical were certain major industrialists who began buying up the property of ruined citizens for pennies, acquiring businesses, real estate, and land. A new class of inflation barons emerged, those who grew rich off the public's collective poverty. The government found it increasingly impossible to stop the avalanche. Each new round of printing was needed to cover growing budget deficits. The central bank, the Reichsbank, essentially became a printing factory, its presses running around the clock. By mid-1922, inflation was already out of control, but the worst was yet to come. Ahead lay the Ruhr crisis, the moment that would drive hyperinflation to apocalyptic levels. By 1922, inflation was painful, but still somewhat contained. But 1923 would become the year of complete collapse, and the trigger was yet another national humiliation, the occupation of the Ruhr. Weimar Germany was struggling to keep up with its reparation payments, partly due to real financial shortages, partly due to political calculations. Some German politicians intentionally delayed payments, hoping the Allies would revise the terms. But France and Belgium decided to respond with force. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland of coal mines, steel plants, and machine factories. This was their way of collecting debts in kind, taking goods instead of waiting for money. The German government responded with a policy of passive resistance. Workers were called upon to strike and refused to work for the occupiers. Factories shut down, transportation ground to a halt, and production was sabotaged. The Ruhr came to a standstill, and so began the next suicidal phase of economic policy. To support the striking workers, paying wages, covering losses, the government once again unleashed the printing presses. The presses ran day and night. The money supply exploded exponentially. The mark collapsed into freefall. In January 1923, one U.S. dollar bought 18,000 marks. By August, 4.6 million marks per dollar. But this was only the beginning. A new class of profiteers thrived amid the chaos. Currency speculators flipped dollars and Swiss francs for outrageous profits. Officials took kickbacks for distributing subsidies to strikers. Smugglers moved scarce goods across borders. A new despised class emerged, known as Rubermacher, those who moved their capital abroad. The elites, bankers, industrialists, politicians quietly transferred assets into foreign currency, buying real estate in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. They knew full well the system was on the brink of collapse. Among ordinary people, anger and despair spread like wildfire. The Ruhr crisis bundled every pain of Weimar into one tangled mess: economic collapse, political weakness, international humiliation, and internal betrayal by the elites. Radical movements flourished in the chaos: far-right paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, communist militias, and new political adventurers who promised to end Weimar's shame. As billions of marks poured off the printing presses, society wasn't merely losing its currency, it was losing its faith in the very state itself. What lay ahead was no longer simply inflation. What lay ahead was hyperinflation, that terrifying moment when even numbers cease to have meaning. The year 1923 entered German history as the year when the very concept of money lost its meaning. This was no longer simply economic collapse. It was a waking nightmare where logic no longer applied. By late 1923, the U.S. dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. $1, 4 trillion. The numbers grew so large that accounting books couldn't fit the zeros, and printing presses couldn't keep up with the need to produce new notes with ever higher denominations. People went shopping with baskets, suitcases, and even baby carriages filled with paper money. Prices changed multiple times a day. Workers were paid twice daily so they could rush to stores before their wages lost even more value by nightfall. In restaurants, waiters ran between tables, rewriting menus in real time as inflation surged mid-meal. Lifelong savings vanished within days. The absurdity reached grotesque proportions. Women burned banknotes in stoves because firewood was more expensive. Children played with stacks of bills like toy blocks. Newspapers left blank spaces on their pages to insert updated prices at the time of sale. Crime skyrocketed. Gangs robbed stores, warehouses, and currency exchanges. A black market flourished, trading in gold, jewelry, foreign currency, and basic necessities. The older generations, pensioners, clerks, artisans, were utterly destroyed. People who had saved for retirement stood in bread lines begging for soup. Many families turned to suicide, unable to bear the humiliation and despair. Here is just one story among thousands of such tragedies. The Bauer family from Dresden. The father, Karl, worked as an accountant at a textile factory. The mother, Anna, was a music teacher. Before the war, they had saved enough for a modest apartment, a small country house, and a modest pension fund in the bank. Life seemed secure, but by mid-1923, all their savings had become worthless paper. Their apartment was sold at auction for what once would have barely covered the cost of a single good meal. Karl lost his job. Anna lost her students. Their daughter Gertrude was forced to drop out of school. By late 1923, the Bauers, like thousands of others, stood in line at a charity kitchen run by the local church. All they had left were 2 suitcases of clothing and an old piano, which they eventually sold for a few loaves of bread. In December 1923, Karl Bauer committed suicide. He could no longer bear the shame and helplessness. Anna and her daughter had to move in with relatives in the countryside. Their story was just one among tens of thousands like it. Particularly cynical were the profiteers who thrived in the chaos, buying up property, businesses, antiques. On the ruins of the old middle class, new kings of hyperinflation arose. Society was seething with growing rage. Accusations of betraying the nation were heard more and more frequently. At the center of this growing hatred stood financial speculators, bankers, segments of the Jewish community, and the liberal politicians of Weimar. Radical parties, both left and right, fed on this hatred like gasoline. The government was losing not only control over the economy, it was losing control over people's minds. The state no longer symbolized protection. It now stood for humiliation, weakness, and shame. The entire society stood at the edge of madness, and ahead, the climax of this catastrophe still awaited. In every society, the middle class is its foundation. Doctors and teachers, small business owners and clerks, engineers, farmers, lawyers, artisans, people who spend years building stable lives and creating futures for their children. But in Weimar, Germany, they became the primary victims of hyperinflation. The poor had always lived on the edge of survival, and the rich had resources to shield themselves. But the middle class was trapped with no escape. Their savings evaporated daily, while wages failed to keep up with the exploding inflation. A familiar pattern unfolded. The craftsman who had saved for retirement, the teacher who had purchased a pension policy, the engineer who had saved for his children's education. All of it vanished before their eyes. What had been a month's salary in the morning was barely pocket change by evening. People sold their furniture, jewelry, paintings, family heirlooms, just to afford a few more days of food. But the most devastating blow was the humiliation. People who once lived with dignity now stood in line for soup, while their children walked barefoot to school. For thousands of men, the only way to feed their families was to accept degrading work, carrying loads, working night shifts, laboring as day laborers. For many women, it even meant prostitution. Meanwhile, a new caste of profiteers flourished. The kings of hyperinflation enriched themselves by buying up properties, businesses, and speculating on foreign currency. Their villas, cars, and lavish parties became objects of hatred for millions of ruined Germans. Inequality wasn't simply sharp, it was obscene. Society split into two castes, those who grew rich in the chaos and those destroyed by it. And it was in this social hell that new radical political movements began to bloom. This explosive mixture of resentment, poverty, and hatred became fuel for nationalists, anti-Semites, communists, and far-right fanatics. Hundreds of thousands of Germans searched for someone to blame. Weimar politicians, bankers, Jews, the Allies, traitors within. Despair bred a thirst for vengeance. In the streets, angry voices shouted, "We have lost everything. We trust no one anymore." It was then that new faces began to emerge. Charismatic demagogues who promised to restore Germany's dignity. They vowed to cleanse the nation of parasites, to punish those who had stolen the people's future. Very soon, the world would know their names. Hyperinflation broke more than wallets. It broke the moral backbone of a nation. By the fall of 1923, even in Berlin it became clear the country was standing on the edge of an abyss, one step away from uncontrollable chaos, famine, and civil war. The old methods no longer worked. What was needed was radical, almost surgical intervention to save what remained of the economy. In November 1923, Hans Luther was appointed finance minister, but the true architect of the rescue operation became Hjalmar Schacht, who would later become one of the most influential economic manipulators of the Third Reich. Under Schacht's leadership, Germany carried out one of the boldest experiments in monetary history, the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark. What did they do? 1. The old Reichsmark, now utterly worthless, was essentially declared dead. 2. The exchange rate was set. 1 Rentenmark, Taras 1 trillion, 1,000 old marks. 3. The new currency was not backed by gold, which Germany scarcely possessed, but instead by the nation's future income, land, real estate, and industrial assets. 4. Money printing was essentially frozen. New emissions were issued only under real economic guarantees. 5. The government slashed state spending, and the tax system was partially reformed to collect real revenues. At the same time, crucial political agreements were reached with the Allies, with support from the United States and the new government under Gustav Stresemann. The situation with reparations began to stabilize. The new currency was issued starting November 15, 1923. By December, the exchange rate stabilized. $1 was worth 4.2 Rentenmarks. Finally, after years of chaos, stability returned. For comparison, just months earlier, $1 had been worth over 4 trillion old marks. Between September and November 1923 alone, over 500 quadrillion marks, yes, quadrillion, 1 followed by 15 zeros, were printed and circulated. Schacht understood that the key was not simply mathematical calculation, but restoring public confidence in money itself. And he succeeded. A population exhausted by disaster overwhelmingly accepted the Rentenmark. However, the reform could not heal all wounds. Millions of people permanently lost their savings. The social scars remained deep. Public trust in the financial system was shattered. Political instability was far from over. The reform stopped hyperinflation, but the demons it had unleashed remained. Hyperinflation had been stopped, but at a terrible price. In truth, the system was saved, not the people. The social fabric of Germany remained torn apart. In just a few months of disaster, Germany lost its most precious asset, the people's trust. Trust in their state, their government, their politicians, their financial institutions, and most fatally, in democracy itself. The Weimar Republic survived on paper, but in the hearts of millions, it had become the Republic of Betrayal. In the public consciousness, a classic set of enemies emerged. Democratic politicians who had sold out Germany by signing the Versailles Treaty. The moneybags, currency speculators, and industrial magnates who profited from inflation. Jews, through widely spread anti-Semitic stereotypes. Foreigners, the Allied powers who plundered Germany with reparations. These images would later become the ideological core of Nazi propaganda. Social fear seeped into every home. People had witnessed how, in a single month, one could lose everything: money, housing, status, dignity. The trauma of hyperinflation became a national psychological wound, festering for years, waiting for a spark. At this moment, new forces emerged. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, still small but increasingly loud, skillfully exploited the fears, grievances, and anger of the German people. A young war veteran, Adolf Hitler, charismatic, aggressive, and a brilliant orator, quickly began gathering around him the disillusioned, humiliated, and embittered. His speeches in Munich beer halls drew larger and larger crowds. His rhetoric was brutally simple. We are poor because we were robbed. We have been betrayed by politicians, Jews, Marxists, and foreigners. We will become a great nation again when we rid ourselves of the parasites. In 1923, at the peak of hyperinflation, Hitler even attempted a coup, the infamous beer hall putsch in Munich. The rebellion failed, and Hitler was imprisoned. But this episode made him a national figure. Meanwhile, major industrialists, bankers, and military circles began to view the far right with increasing interest. The democratic government appeared weak, ineffective, unable to control the crowds or the economy. They longed for a strong hand, order, and the restoration of state authority. The betrayal of the elites became the final ingredient in the coming catastrophe. Parts of big business financed the radicals, hoping to benefit from an authoritarian regime that would crush strikes, unions, and opposition, and restore stability. Soon, these investments would bear their fatal fruit. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not just an economic tragedy. It was the incubator of Nazism, its legacy, a scar that would forever alter the fate of Germany, Europe, and the entire world. The Weimar hyperinflation was more than just a collapse of currency. It was a laboratory of what happens when trust itself breaks, when a society loses faith in stability, in fairness, in its government, and in its very future. The true lesson of Weimar lies not in the countless zeros that once filled its currency notes. Its meaning lies in how easily an economic crisis can become a moral and political disaster. We have seen how reparations and defeat in war became a financial noose, how the government, seeking easy answers, unleashed the printing presses, how elites betrayed their people, moving capital abroad and profiting from chaos, how the broken middle class became prey to ideologies of hatred. The tragedy of Weimar stands as living proof that money is not just paper. It is belief. It is a collective psychological contract between people, government, and the future. And when that contract breaks, no currency in the world can stop the collapse that follows. This is why Weimar remains a terrifying reminder even in the 21st century. No society is immune from repeating the old mistakes. Dear friends, thank you for listening to this story of Weimar hyperinflation, a drama of money, betrayal, and human nature. If you enjoy our deep dives into history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, and please leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is. We love seeing our community from every corner of the world.